With any philosopher who we might be choosing to study, it's a natural question. What am I going to get out of investing the time and the thought and perhaps even aggravation of studying their works? And this is a perfectly reasonable question. In the case of David Hume, I think that there's some pretty strong answers to this, and we can start with the superficial ones. Well, we all know that he's a really important philosopher, and you don't want to skip over any of the really big names, and even down to the present. If you do polling of philosophers, or you look at histories of philosophy or introductory philosophy textbooks and classes, David Hume gets mentioned a lot. That's nice, right? That gestures towards something. Why is David Hume considered to be so important, to be, up there with, say, René Descartes or Immanuel Kant, who's going to follow shortly after him, or Aristotle or Plato or any of these other big names? Well, it has something to do with the importance of his philosophy and his works and the influence that he has exercised, both for and against him, people picking things up and also criticizing things in him, responding to him in important ways in the more than 2 centuries since he has passed away after writing quite a bit. And some of his writings, by the way, were published after he died. We'll talk about why that's the case. So, Hume is incredibly influential. We can say that he's part of this important lineage or tradition, or sometimes called school of empiricists. So he's going to influence other people who identify with, let's call it, empiricism, broadly speaking. He's also going to provoke a kind of counter-reaction by somebody I've already mentioned, Immanuel Kant, who takes Hume as providing a challenge to causality itself that Kant thinks we have to address. Hume winds up being very influential on British philosophy in general, particularly on the 20th century analytics, who will not only be, taking him as a major figure, but also drawing upon him, sometimes against, as I mentioned, against him, saying Hume is wrong about this, sometimes saying he's actually right about things in terms of moral philosophy and metaphysics and philosophy of religion. So A.J. Ayer is a prime example of somebody who does talk about Kant, but very much acknowledges himself as being within the current of Hume. But you'll find influences by Hume in all sorts of other interesting places as well, including continental philosophy. Not only are people like Gilles Deleuze in the late 20th century writing about him, taking things from him, but we see that Edmund Husserl, when it comes to how association works, particularly in his passive synthesis lectures, is going to be taking things almost directly from David Hume. Lev Shestov, the great anti-systematic existentialist philosopher, references Hume quite a bit. So you'll find him in a surprisingly large number of places being brought up. I also think personally that Hume is a great thinker and a great writer. I disagree with him on many things, but he's worthwhile, and also, once you get past the language, perhaps, quite fun to read. I greatly enjoy going back to his works. It's one reason why I make sure to teach him in classes. It's not just because he is influential, not just because he has interesting ideas, but also because he is fun to teach and to get other people interested in. And his, proposals and ideas and engagements with other philosophers, I would say, are interesting in their own right. And then there's one other reason why I would say it's particularly important to study Hume. And that is because he has, through his influence, and because he's such a great wordsmith, he has bequeathed us a number of cultural reference points that are basically like sound bites or the equivalent thereof. And it's good to know what Hume actually did think about things. So for example, probably the most famous one, reason is and can only be the slave of the passions, right? Well, that's not exactly what Hume thinks. He did say it, but there's a lot more to the relationship between reasoning and our emotional life than just that soundbite. So you only find that out when you actually study him, or at least study glosses upon him. The so-called Hume's fork, that occurs at the end of the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding about, relations of ideas or matters of fact. If a book doesn't contain those, consign it to the flames, for it contains nothing, I'm paraphrasing, but sophistry and illusion. Yes, he says that. Does he really mean that? Again, by studying his work, you can see that he's much more of a judicious writer than that would imply. So those are some good reasons for getting into it. Now let's shift to a different topic. As always, there are some practical questions for the self-directed learner that we really do need to bring up. You might not have thought of these, but you will want to think through these. And these have to do with Hume's texts, his writings, and how you should proceed through them, how you can actually make some headway. And the first thing I'm going to bring up is what I like to call the issue of non-translation. Now, this is something specific to English writing texts in philosophy from previous centuries, written for different kinds of audiences than we typically are today. And here's the problem or the issue in a nutshell. So with authors like Plato writing in Greek, or Friedrich Nietzsche writing in German, or René Descartes writing in Latin and French, if we want to take their work and put it into contemporary 21st century ordinary person English, we can do that, right? And so there's always newer translations arising. We can't really do that when it comes to, 17th, 18th, 19th, even 20th century, sometimes difficult, English language writers, because what we would be doing instead is sort of a boulderization of their works. And people don't generally like that. You're messing around with the text, right? So you're stuck with Hume's 18th century English. And actually in some editions, you'll also get the weird kind of punctuation and capitalization that people were doing back then as well. So that can be a bit of a problem. Just expect that to be the case. You may have to expand your vocabulary a bit in order to fully understand what Hume is saying. And words don't always mean exactly what they do in the present when we're reading them in an older text. So that's one thing to be forewarned about. Another thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind as well, sort of, again, background knowledge, is Hume is a philosopher. He's also a historian. He's a literary figure. These were not rigidly distinguished from each other, the way that we typically do in universities today, where we say, you go over there, you go over there, and maybe we invite each other over once in a while, and we shelve things differently on the bookshelves as well, in bookstores and libraries, and perhaps even in our own home collections. So Hume is writing in a context in which, there's all sorts of blending and back and forth. And the field of philosophy was rather different. You are not going to see Hume referring to Aristotle as being an important philosopher very often. in part because there wasn't as much interest in Aristotle in the 18th century. He tended to be identified with a moribund scholasticism of the Middle Ages and modern period that was viewed as kind of a, backwater. Instead, you're going to see Hume talking much more about other philosophical traditions, the Platonist, the skeptical, the Stoic, the Epicurean, to talk about 4 main essays that he writes about philosophers. He's going to be engaging with a lot of the philosophers of the previous centuries, for example, René Descartes, Nicolas Malebranche, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, all of these people as well. And some people who you've probably never really heard of as well. And that's quite all right. He's in a different milieu than we are. I do want to say that Hume is a big fan of Cicero, who he actually takes some models from, which we'll talk about in a bit. And you're going to see Hume is quite erudite, bringing up quotations, passages from all sorts of people. So, just be ready for that. Good editions will typically have, some footnotes or some glosses on that'll help you understand what's going on. Another thing that I think might be helpful to keep in mind from the very start, Hume is not a systematic philosopher in the way that some other people that you might have read is. He's not totally anti-systematic either. He is developing a set of, interconnected studies of things, but he's doing so over time, and it doesn't produce a complete and perfected system. He's also not just proceeding from a bunch of axioms or principles and then deducing things. He thinks that it's really quite important to look at the world and figure things out along those lines. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, it's natural that you're going to ask, well, great, that's all fine. That's nice context, background information. What should I actually read? And we're going to get to the question of what to start with in just a bit. But I do want to say a few things about, in very, very broad strokes, about what is out there and available. So you notice I've got a lot of books piled up. Essays, moral and political and literary, big collection here. You can find this in smaller volumes as well. This is a really helpful edition. It's been done over and over again, originally put together by Eugene Miller, and including a whole bunch of different essays, right? So this is a text in whatever form you're going to get it that you probably want to get your hands on. Another thing that you'll probably, if you want to do some serious study of David Hume, you probably you'll want to get a treatise of human nature, and this is the typical thing, revised in notes by Niditch, one big thick book. Okay, this is one of Hume's very early and important works. Not that important in his lifetime, unfortunately. He exaggerates a little bit in saying it fell stillborn from the press, but it certainly didn't, as we say, set the world on fire. As a matter of fact, his essays were much more widely read during his lifetime. And I think that it can also be quite good to get your hands. I mean, you can find these separate from each other, but you can also find the two inquiries, regarding human understanding and moral principles of morals in one handy volume, again edited in this case by Niditch. That's good to get. And one text that you're definitely not going to want to skip at all, if you're interested in reading and understanding Hume, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. You can, again, find this from a lot of different places. Sometimes it's bundled together with some of his other texts concerning religion, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But, that's those are some of the volumes that you're going to want to get your hands on. And there is good news about this. You don't have to necessarily buy all of this. Any good library has probably got available at least one copy, if not more, of each of these texts, and probably other texts by and about David Hume. And you can find practically all of them available online as well, because his works are in the public domain. So there's a lot of good stuff there to help get you started. Now let's talk about where and how to start. So I gave a lot of thought to this question about where do you actually start with David Hume? And there isn't any suggesting itself right off the bat as the only correct answer starting point, as there is for certain philosophers who may have given this some thought. And I'm actually going to propose to you something that may seem a little bit strange, that you don't begin immediately with philosophical works as such. I would say that, and again, you're perfectly free to ignore this suggestion and go on to other works, that maybe if you haven't read any David Hume, maybe the place to begin is with this essay that you can find bundled together sometimes that he wrote close to the end of My Own Life, where Hume is speaking in his own words to you about, his biography and what he takes to be important in it. And it's short, and you could easily read your way through it in less than an hour, perhaps less than 20 minutes for a lot of readers. And then there's one other thing that I think could be quite helpful to begin with, and it's actually one of his essays, and it's called here we go of essay writing, right? Where he is giving you his take on how and why and in what manner the elegant part of mankind, who are learned and conversable, ought to write, and also in some respects ought to read and interpret. And I think this is very interesting. He talks about what is going on with men of letters, and this could extend to women of letters too, in his own age, but I think it also could apply to our own. And so this gives you a sense of what Hume is up to, why he's writing the things that he is. Now, so those are kind of idiosyncratic starting points, and they both will be very quickly resolved. You want to get into some serious philosophy. Where do you want to go? Now, I'm of several different minds about this. I think that there could be several useful starting points. And I would actually suggest not beginning where I think a lot of people who would view themselves as more serious scholars than myself might suggest that you begin with the treatise of human nature. I mean, it's good stuff. It is a systematic work. It is Hume's first major work, right? And you should definitely read it at some time. And I would say fairly early on, but I don't know. I've been teaching Hume and introducing people to him for many, many years. And I would actually say that maybe the text that I use in Introduction to Philosophy, not the entire text, but portions of the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, I would actually say that might be the better place to begin. And there's a couple reasons for that. You're getting a lot of his key ideas, both from the treatise and from some other works as well, mixed in there and worked out in a more polished form. Hume himself there were 3 books to the Treatise of Human Nature. The first book is, of the understanding, And that's what he's going to transform into the Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding. The second book is Of the Passions, and he will present parts of that in other works that we'll talk about in a bit. And then the third part is Of Morals, and so that is going to become, the Inquiry Concerning Principles of Morals, right? So I would say start with the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and then maybe go on to the Inquiry Concerning Principles of Morals, or the treatise. Those are good starting points for getting a sense of the big picture of Hume's philosophy and some of his key arguments and assertions. The so-called Hume's fork you're going to get at the end of the first inquiry, that concerning human understanding. If you want that, reason is and can only be the slave of the passions, well, that's going to come about in book 2 of the treatise. So those are good places to start. It's interesting with Hume, though, because he is such a good essay writer, there's some other entrance points that you could have. So if you like comparative philosophy and you want to get Hume's take on certain matters with that, he has these 4 essays, the Epicurean, the Stoic, the Platonist, and the Skeptic, that give you his point of view. He's kind of loosely connecting these things on those 4 different types or schools or temperaments in philosophy, and I think that could be quite interesting. Hume also has quite a few critical, aesthetic essays that are worth checking out, and I would say the 2 most important, the ones that get referenced quite frequently, are On the Standard of Taste and On Tragedy. You shouldn't avoid either of those, and you can find those in these essays, moral, political, and literary. But I would also say that you might want to, depending on what your interest is, you might want to, early on, after you've read the first inquiry, approach the works in which he's talking about religious topics as such. And some of these are published posthumously, in part because of the milieu in which he's in. He's already, been turned down for a university post because he's viewed as possibly being an atheist, which he very well may have been. So, the dialogues concerning natural religion, I've sometimes used that as an introduction to Hume's thought in an introductory philosophy class for people who don't have any background in him. He's got some others, the Natural History of Religion, very well worth checking out, Of Superstition and Enthusiasm. He's got an essay on suicide and a future state. So those are all important, I would say, starting points as well. I do want to talk about some of these other books that I have piled up that might be helpful for you to hear about. So we've talked about Hume's own works, right? And then I do want to mention one other thing. So we've got this Hume's Ethical Writings volume that you'll find in some libraries. And it's edited and introduced by Alistair MacIntyre, major moral philosopher of the 20th and 21st century. And he's got a good editor's introduction where he says, an introduction should introduce. It should not be an attempt as a substitute for the book at which it's introducing. I'm not going to try here to summarize adequately the arguments which Hume uses in the parts of his writings which follow. I shall try rather to relate those arguments in a simple way to the general body of his work and to his life. And so that's what he's doing. He's connecting the dots for you in the introduction. And I do want to point out that Hume is somebody that MacIntyre engages with a lot, and you will find a good discussion of him in this short history of ethics, which is, again, from the 60s, he's got a chapter, The British 18th Century Argument, which is concerned in large part with Hume. I'll mention two other histories of philosophy. These two, by the way, are contemporaries with each other, and before MacIntyre. So Bertrand Russell actually has an entire chapter devoted to Hume. I'm not a big fan of Russell's history of philosophy. I think it has many flaws, and it's interesting to read. Russell's a great writer, but you're getting more Russell sometimes in his takes than you are the actual philosophers. And he actually, the section is not bad. I would say that this line might give you some idea. Hume's philosophy, whether true or false, represents the bankruptcy of 18th century reasonableness, right? He starts out like Locke with the intention of being sensible and empirical, taking nothing on trust, but seeking whatever instruction is to be obtained from experience and observation, but having a better intellect than Locke's, a greater acuteness in analysis, and a smaller capacity for accepting comfortable inconsistencies, he arrives at the disastrous conclusion that from experience and observation, nothing is to be learned. There is no such thing as a rational belief. Now that seems a bit excessive. But he's got an interesting take. If you want something that's a little bit more sedate, Friedrich Cobblestone's History of Philosophy, the volume that is The British Philosophers from Hobbes to Hume, actually has a number of chapters going through Hume's work, for and then a chapter entitled For and Against Hume, talking about the criticism and reinterpretation of Hume. And here we're talking about, over 100 pages of summary and analysis, and also excerpts from his work. So Cobblestone could be quite helpful for you, not only with Hume, but in general. As a side note, Cobblestone was the person who we often used in graduate school to get boned up on people. I'll also mention some interpretive stuff, and actually let me begin just by bringing up a number of, let's call them essay books. So we've got Vera Chappell did he edited a volume years back in the 60s of some pretty great classic essays on David Hume's work, so that's worth checking out. It's just called Hume. There's obviously companions like A Companion to Hume, which is edited by Elizabeth Radcliffe, published by Blackwell. Again, we've got 28 different essays here. This is a bit more contemporary. We're talking 2008. So that's a good one. Cambridge published A Companion to Hume, that one's got 15 different essays in it, again, by major Hume scholars. And then, this is an interesting one, Reading Hume on Human Understanding. This is from Oxford, and it's got 14 different essays discussing Hume. It's also, a bit more contemporary as well. So, well worth checking out. And then there's a few others that I wanted to bring up. So Norman Kemp-Smith, who's, I think a lot of people know more because of the Kant stuff, he's got a whole book here, which is about the philosophy of David Hume, a critical study of its origins and central doctrines. Now, Kemp-Smith is a philosopher writing for other philosophers to help them out understanding it. But this is very, very comprehensive. I really enjoyed reading it. There's also, A.J. Ayer wrote a book in this Past Masters thing on Hume, talking about life and character, aims and methods, bodies and self, cause and effect, morals, politics and religion. Now, with Ayer, you're probably getting less Hume and more Ayer's take, and that is also the situation with this book by Gilles Deleuze, who thought Hume was somebody well worth studying. Empiricism and Subjectivity, an essay on Hume's theory of human nature. I really enjoy reading Deleuze, but again, with Deleuze, you're getting more Deleuze than you are the original topic. And there's two other works I think could be useful for you at some point or another. If you like intellectual biographies, and what are intellectual biographies? They're biographies that stress the development of a thinker's ideas over time and what the context is and who they're engaging with. This book by James Harris, Hume, an intellectual biography, published 2015. I would say this is probably the go-to for you. And then I want to signal one other book that came out recently, The Great Guide by Julian Baggini. It's subtitled, What David Hume Can Teach Us About Being Human and Living Well. So this is kind of a biography, but it's really quite interesting because what Baggini is interested in is not the traditional thing. Let's place the thinker within their context. Great stuff. He wants to derive the lessons available for us from not just Hume's writing, but also his life. And he frames these in terms of Humean maxims and aphorisms, which you have as an appendix in the back of the book. This is really quite interesting. And, Baggini's a great writer. I think you can learn a lot from that. So where to get started? I think we've talked about that quite enough at this point. It can be quite helpful as you're approaching an author that you're going to study on your own, granted with plenty of help from various resources on the internet, and I mentioned these secondary works that can be quite useful to understand the projects and the motives and the context of a person's writing. Now, Hume is part of what we call the Enlightenment, and we use that to talk about like the 18th century and Western Europe in general. But one thing that we really have to keep in mind is the Enlightenment isn't just one thing happening everywhere. We could say, well, there's different words for it. French, siècle de lumière, the Germans, the Aufklärung. But what we should understand is things are happening differently in Germany, in France, in Great Britain, which also includes Scotland, in America, and in a few other places as well. And we often talk about the Scottish Enlightenment, and you might say that the Scotland, at least the part of it, like Edinburgh, that David Hume is living in, I mean, he's in Paris for a while as well, that is one of the most enlightened of the Enlightenment places. It's really going like gangbusters. And so he is a vital part of this, but he's also being shaped by it. And there's interconnections between the continent and Great Britain, and particularly Scotland. So, Hume is somebody who knows what's going on in different places. He's actually, been on the continent. That's important to know as far as the context goes. Another thing that I think is really important to understand is that Hume is writing in a context and a time and situation in which there's a lot of upheaval and conflict about religion. There's this kind of secularizing force that's happening. At the same time, religious people are pushing back. I mentioned earlier that Hume was essentially denied a university post because of concerns about his orthodoxy, right? And Hume himself is quite interested in religion as a phenomenon and as something that can get in the way of rationality and the ongoing development of science and culture. So you're going to see him as, a sort of a genteel opponent of religion. He's not like Thomas Paine, writing the age of reason and sort of a firebrand and advocating deism so that atheism won't bring everything down. Instead, Hume is taking a different sort of approach. One that I will mention, he is borrowing in part from Cicero. If you want to understand what Hume is doing in his dialogues concerning natural religion, it really helps to have read Cicero's work on the nature of the gods, where he has, again, 3 different people discussing, can we prove that gods exist, what are their nature, and one of them is actually going to be a skeptic who's also a priest, right? So there's some really interesting strategies that are being borrowed from that, and that's because of the milieu that Hume is in. He feels that he can't publish all of his thoughts on religion because it would get him in some trouble. I think that it's also important to realize that in Hume's time, one way of doing philosophy that you see, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his contemporary, and for a while his friend, and Hume was a great benefactor of him. You see Locke doing this, you see René Descartes doing this, is the sort of appeal to personal experience, observation, and reflection. The philosopher is saying, I look within myself and I find this or don't find this. I find things are connected in this way. And this could actually be a little bit off-putting to a reader of the present who's like, well, I'm not finding that. Who the hell are you? Well, this is part of the way in which philosophy is often being done in that time. Hume is also writing at a time where it's not so simple as, well, there's continental rationalism and British empiricism, because there's a lot of mixing back and forth. But these are 2 really big overarching concerns. Hume is writing about things that maybe we don't buy into these days, like there being innate ideas that we're born with. Then again, there's some people who do believe in that stuff even today, right? So Hume is definitely taking the empiricist side, but Hume is also a skeptic, and he's not as he calls it, a extreme or Pyrrhonian skeptic. He's more of a mitigated skeptic who says there's a lot of stuff that we actually can't prove 100%. We can only go by probabilities. And by the way, cause and effect, it's kind of shaky when we look at it. There's a lot of things that we take for granted that maybe aren't 100% or even 50%, or maybe we can't even put a number on them, right? That is really central to his motivation. But Hume is not the sort of skeptic that wants to knock arguments down just to knock them down. He's not a spoiler. He's not a troll. He's not that kind of jerk. He genuinely wants to know. He genuinely is motivated by wanting to understand as much as he can about human beings and how we work. That's why he actually writes a treatise of human nature. He's committed to the ideas that he's setting out here about the passions, or about how the understanding works and the ideas that we have, how they're associated, or his rather conservative moral philosophy. Those are things that he is genuinely interested in and is trying to pursue as best he can in a way that's rational, in a way that's based on evidence, in a way that takes us as far as we can go, and then says, all right, after this, we can't really know things. We have to be a little bit more careful about what we commit ourselves to. And that includes a lot of things about social reform, but it also includes a lot of things about religious beliefs or about metaphysics in general. So that's stuff that might be helpful for understanding the wider context and the deeper motivations of Hume. I do have a bit of advice for you derived from the format of Hume's works. So a lot of what he's writing are essays, right? We have somewhat systematic works like, the Treatise on Human Nature. We have dialogues at times. In the dialogues, no one single person represents Hume's point of view. He's having us, the reader, enter in, and there's a larger strategy that's going on. In the treatise, Hume is speaking for himself. In all of these essays, he's tackling different projects and problems and issues, and sometimes telling you what he thinks, sometimes speculating, sometimes attacking other people's stuff. So you've got to pay attention to the genre of the work that Hume is writing in, and don't have the same expectations for each of them. You can't apply the same, basic assumptions about the treatise as you can to an essay like On the Standard of Taste. You also don't want to be too worried about perfect consistency because, frankly, that doesn't actually exist for Hume. If you take everything that he's saying very literally and apply it to his own works, it doesn't all add up. But that doesn't mean that it's thereby, annulled or no good or anything like that. It just means that you can only push things so far. I mean, he does actually make claims in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding about human nature that, given all the things he said about causality and observation, he probably doesn't have any right to make. But you got to go with it and see what he's actually trying to say. And then I always say, first you understand, then you criticize. So generating an understanding of what he's saying is very important. Entering into kind of a dialogue with the work. And I think you should, as you're trying to read Hume, after you get past the vocabulary, which may be a little tricky for you for reasons we've already talked about, think of it as you dialoguing with this really interesting, great thinker who's also, not perfect and doesn't claim to be. So rereading, going back over the passages, reflecting on it, trying to apply it to your own life and situation, having a conversation or entering into the conversation that Hume himself is having with the reader, you and me. That can be quite helpful. I also think that he's going to make a lot of hyperbolic statements. We talked about Hume's fork and consign those books to the flames. He doesn't really mean that. Reason is and can only be the slave of the passions. Does he really mean that? No, you could read his work and find out that that's not the case. And if it was, he wouldn't write the treatise in the first place. So when you encounter these big hyperbolic statements, realize that those are rhetoric. Those are Hume being somebody who comes up with a great line and realizes that this can be used to hook the reader. It's almost like he's created a bunch of memes, more than 2 centuries before memes are identified as such and then morph into what we now call internet memes. That could be helpful as you're reading them. The other thing is, realize that, this is the last part, these works are written for a literate audience who will take the time to read them. Don't try to speed run through these things. You're not going to get anything out of doing that with Hume any more than you would with Hegel or Nietzsche or any other great author. These are designed to be lingered over and thought through. Okay, so there's also what we can call problems and issues that you as a beginner don't necessarily need to worry about. Like, did Hume, fully treat the problem of induction? Figure out what the hell Hume is actually saying first before worrying about that sort of matter. He's going to say a lot of things about a lot of things and sometimes stake out what appear to be pretty extreme positions. Hume, by his very nature, is not, he is radical in certain respects, but he's not that radical. He can undermine causality, cause and effect, and say, yeah, we don't really understand what's going on there. But then he comes up with his own theory about how that works. That's based on habit and custom, and actually a certain kind of instinct even we can talk about. And then he can be perfectly fine to go and play some pool, as he calls it, walk into his billiards room and not worry about these metaphysical concerns or doubts. So keep that in mind as you're reading him. I mean, there's some really cool implications to what Hume is saying, but he is not himself given to following out that hyperbole that he sometimes uses. So, when it's not as if we read Hume and now there's no certainty or probability about anything. Another good example, I don't find any sensation or little nodule that is myself. That doesn't mean that we don't have selves. When Hume is concerned with big picture issues, he's not taking a stand that is as radical or unreasonable as we might believe, right? Hume obviously believed that he's an author, that there's at least some bits that are kind of permanent. He's just saying there's no one single thing we can call ourself. And now that leads to another interesting topic that I think you don't have to worry about. Is Hume's concern about the self the same thing as Buddhism's doctrine of anatman, no self? I mean, deal with the fact that there's many different ways of interpreting that within Buddhism, because it's not like there's one big thing out there called Buddhism. There's a whole bunch of different schools. Put that aside. Did Hume get this from the Buddhists? We don't know. People are making arguments one way or the other. We've not arrived at any sort of scholarly consensus about that, yes or no. And in a way, it doesn't really matter that much where he got the ideas from. He's worked out the ideas, and he's providing them to you. These are not things that a beginner has to be particularly concerned about. Maybe later on down the line, if you're really, really into Hume, those will be concerns for you. One other thing that I think that maybe you don't need to worry too much about, politically, Hume was quite conservative. He was what they call a Tory back then. And, when you read through his works, you're going to see that he doesn't want an awful lot of change. He actually winds up being a quite important author in terms of his ethics and political philosophy for at least thoughtful conservatism. I mean, he would take a look at what's called conservatism today and probably bend over and puke, because it's not conservative. It hasn't even conserved what conservatism is. But don't worry about that either so much. So you can be wherever you want in the political spectrum or spectrums, and you can read Hume and get something out of it. You don't have to worry about what his politics were or his stance on the American Revolution. That's kind of extraneous to the epistemology and the metaphysics and even a lot of the moral philosophy. So you don't need to worry too much about those matters. So just a few words to end. I think you can tell that David Hume is somebody who, although I don't agree with him on a lot of things, I think he's a really important and interesting philosopher, somebody who's actually fun to read and think along with. I mentioned, being like a conversation partner with him, and I think that his works, once you understand them, really do lend themselves to that. And I hope that these bits of advice that I've given you prove helpful for those of you who want to study David Hume or perhaps have already begun studying David Hume's works and thought. He's definitely not somebody who you want to skip in the history of philosophy, and you'll probably derive a lot of benefit from engaging with his works and thought, even if you do find yourself at odds with or critical of him on a lot of points. I mean, think about, just for an example of that, Hume talks about, Kant talks about Hume as awakening him from this dogmatic slumber, and he, gets another first-rate philosopher engaged in the stuff that we will consider to be his major work. And so I think David Hume can do things sort of like that for you, but you might also be attracted to his thought. You won't know until you get on the David Hume train, and we've mentioned there's a lot of different ways that you can go with it. They're all fine. Just keep on studying, keep on reading. And we'll be doing many more of these self-directed study, advice videos about all sorts of other philosophers. You might find it useful to go back to some of the ones that I've already developed. So there you go. That's all that I have to say. Happy reading ahead.